go. And then I will share my screen and then just kind of get started here. Okay, can you all see the slides? Okay, so put it in presentation mode. Okay, so yeah, I'd like to welcome you all to this presentation. I'm here to just talk today a little bit about the OpenHawks program and to kind of provide some information that people might want to know before they apply. And I hope I won't talk for too long. I'm kind of planning on talking for about half an hour about some of the basics of the program, and then we can spend the rest of the time talking about your own project ideas or any questions that you might have. So I really do just want to kind of focus on the program itself and talk a little bit about OER to start with too. So I don't know if you both kind of are familiar with OER yet or not, but essentially open educational resources are any teaching, learning, and research resources that are free of cost and access barriers, which also carry legal permission for open use. So this last part is kind of confusing to people sometimes. Whoops, the free and open part. The free of cost and access barriers, I think is pretty intuitive to most people. So most OER is available online for free. It's not behind any sort of paywall or any sort of, other type of access barrier. But then also it carries legal permission for open use. So that means that OER are licensed, usually using a Creative Commons license, which allows an author to tell readers exactly what they can and can't do with the work. So with OER, you do keep your copyright. That's sometimes a misconception, but you do kind of keep your copyright to your work, but you sort of specify to your users exactly how they can use your work. So that could mean you just want them to use it as is. You don't want people making derivatives or changing it at all the way up to CC BY license, which allows people to not only use your work, but create derivatives, make changes, make any sort of adaptations to any local context or anything like that, as long as they credit you with the original authorship. The other thing that's kind of important to know about OER is that they include open textbooks, but it's not just textbooks. Anything that you would use in the process of teaching and that meets these kind of two requirements are considered OER. So that would be things like videos, test bank questions, interactive modules, multimedia, basically, any sort of materials that you would use for teaching. Now, I don't want to talk too long about finding and sharing OER, since that's kind of a whole other presentation in and of itself. But for people who are interested in applying for the grants, I really do kind of encourage them to do sort of sort of like almost like a mini lit review, sort of just kind of look to see what's out there in your discipline, and in the particular area that you're planning on sort of developing your project with. And that kind of is for two reasons. The first is that you might find some great source material that's already out there that you can adapt, or even use as is if it's already in pretty good shape. But the other reason is so that you can kind of see some examples of what OER looks like in your discipline. So you can get kind of a feel of what platforms are typically used, what formats, how things are organized, how multimedia is incorporated and things like that. But unfortunately, it's not super easy to find OER. It would be nice if it was just like sort of one search engine, one discovery tool, one repository that would house it all. But because of the way that, OER comes into the world, it's not published, it's published in a lot of different ways. Let's just say that. Sometimes people will just put, an OER on the web on their own. Sometimes it is part of like a program like OpenHawks, and they're put in kind of different places as a result. But these things I have on the screen here are good places to start. I don't know if you have used an advanced search with Google before, but that can be often a really great way to start searching for OER. Let's see if this is going to pull up for me. It's not. Oh boy. Okay, there we go. So I'll just show you really quick. You can just Google advanced search on Google. And when you go to the advanced search interface, you can see that way at the bottom here, under the way that you sort of like narrow your results, you can narrow results by the usage rights. So if you select free to use or share here, and then just type your keywords into the top box like you would with a normal Google search. Let's just try like engineering OER as an example. You can see when I run this search, all of the results come from, various platforms and repositories that include OER. And so that's one kind of quick and dirty way to filter out, a Google search just for OER. But there are other places too that you can go. I won't demonstrate all of these because I don't know why, but my computer doesn't want to seem to let me open links today very easily. But the Oasis Meta Finder is another great place to look. It's kind of a meta search tool that looks across all sorts of different OER platforms and collections. So I think currently it scans about 95 different collections for OER. And so you can run one search in that tool and it will kind of keep you from having to keep going and hunting and pecking in various search tools to find this stuff. Another big one is OER Commons. This is not a discovery tool per se. It's more like a repository where people kind of store their OER. They also can link to it too if it already exists somewhere else. But it's kind of, I would say it's the largest OER repository in existence, and it covers, all of the grade levels all the way from like K-12 all the way through college. And it includes not only textbooks, but all the other kind of ancillary materials as well. We have like a group within that OER Commons called the Iowa Colleges and Universities group, which has been put together by this group called Iowa OER, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But essentially, the items in this group are OER that's already being used in colleges and universities within the state. So some of our OpenHawks projects that have already been completed are already in that group. But it can be a good way to just kind of see what other people in the state are using. But I would actually suggest if you're kind of just doing an initial search on a topic that you don't go right to that group, but instead go to the sort of larger OER Commons interface and look through the whole collection for relevant resources. And then finally, the Open Textbook Library is a large collection of textbooks. So this is not the ancillaries, but just online textbooks. And the nice thing about Open Textbook Library is that it's peer reviewed. And so, they work pretty hard at Open Textbook Library to kind of solicit reviews on all these books. And so a lot of them do kind of have a pretty robust set of peer review. These are definitely not exhaustive. There are lots of other OER collections and repositories in existence. If you want to find out more, I would encourage you to just go to the library's OER page. We have a guide that includes kind of a more exhaustive list of different places to search. Okay, so that's just a little bit about OER, but I do kind of want to switch gears now and talk about the actual OpenHawks program. So this is a 3-year pilot. It's a grant program that's funded by the Provost Innovation Fund. So most of the money does come from the Provost office, although we do have some additional financial support from student government and from the libraries. And it's administered by the libraries. And we kind of have support from a lot of different groups and organizations and departments on campus. So we work pretty closely with student government. We work pretty closely with OTILT, if you're familiar with them, the Office of Teaching and Learning with Technology. But it is sort of administered through the library, and the money kind of flows through the library. So that's kind of important to know. This is the 3rd round of the pilot. So technically this is the final round of the pilot, but we're hoping that, we will get continued funding after this. We're just kind of pounding the pavement right now, trying to find some additional funding because we do, really believe in this program and hope that we can continue it. So anyway, it's intended to support faculty and graduate students, or anyone really who teaches a class at the university who would like to use OER, who are interested in using OER, but maybe don't have the time or the resources or the help to get it all done. And so the idea is to provide financial compensation to help with that. Time does not equal money, but in some instances it kind of can. If you really are just very pressed for time, one of the things that you could use this money for is to get a course release. You would have to talk to your DEO. I mean, that's, you wouldn't just like be able to count on getting a course release since that's all done through your department, but that's one thing you could sort of do with this funding. Another thing is to compensate yourself for your time. So say you're still teaching a full load during the course of this grant, but you're going to be developing your project on top of that. You can certainly compensate yourself for that effort. Other people have compensated colleagues, students, basically anybody who you would have sort of working with you, editors, graphic designers, collaborators, anybody who you might want to sort of like hire to help would be fair game. You can use the money to buy equipment, software. Yeah, so those are some of the main things that we've seen people use the money for. We don't have any real restrictions on what the money can be used for, as long as it's in some way sort of materially supporting these projects. So the application, the call for proposal is open right now, and the application deadline is April 30th. Once that April 30th deadline hits, we'll start reviewing the applications right away. We have a panel who does the review, and it's 5 people, 2 librarians, 2 faculty members who have already created OER and are pretty conversant with, OER discourse, and then an instructional services specialist who can help kind of identify some course design issues that librarians and faculty might not be super aware of. So that team goes through all the applications. We try to get at least 2 reviewers on each application. And then we meet together for a few norming sessions afterwards to kind of see that we're rating things sort of consistently. We use rubrics to do all the scoring. I'll get into all that in just a few minutes about kind of how it's all reviewed and everything. But once we make our selections for who receives funding, that actual funding will be released in July 2021. So these go kind of on the fiscal year. So this project is for fiscal year 22. And so the libraries will release the money in July, and then it will kind of flow through to the departments, which can sometimes be a bit of a messy process, but yeah, we could talk about that later. We ask that these projects are completed in a year, which is maybe a little ambitious, especially if it's a project where you're writing a whole sort of like textbook length project from scratch. And with COVID and everything, during our last round, we have several projects that sort of aren't even done yet. They were supposed to be done last summer, but they're not done yet. And that's, we can't really do anything about that. So we're just trying to kind of work with people to get things done when they can. But we do try to look for sort of a rough 1-year completion window. And then once they're done, we ask that you send the project to us for archiving and distribution. So we will put the OERs into Iowa Research Online, or IRO, which is our institutional repository. And that's kind of the database that houses a lot of faculty scholarship at the university. And we sort of use that repository to make articles and other research materials open access for people. And so we ask that a copy gets deposited into IRO, and then we distribute the OER out to the various repositories. So we try to get it into OER Commons, into Open Textbook Library if it's a book, and all of the other places that we want to see it live as well. So the main goal is really kind of twofold. It's to save students money on their textbooks primarily, because, as we all know, a lot of students can't afford them, and it's becoming, more and more of a problem as time goes on. And also to really support student learning. So we're not only looking, to save the money, but we're also looking for projects that are really going to support their learning. Okay, so I think to go out to the website now, I'm going to have to X out of this PowerPoint. And let's see, I'll just go to the website here. So there's a few things I'd like to show you about how to apply and the specifics of the grant program. So if you just Google OpenHawks, this is kind of our main page, and it contains most of the information that you'll need to know before you apply. We've got our link here for the call for proposals, our application survey, and then the evaluation rubrics that our review committee uses to sort of score and make sort of the first pass at evaluating the application. So you should be aware before you apply that there are all of these different types of awards that you can apply for. And they run the gamut anywhere from the $500 to $1,000 adoption grant all the way up to OER creation. And you can kind of read here about what these different grants sort of entail, but obviously adopting an existing textbook isn't nearly as much work as creating a new one. And so that's why we have all of these different sort of levels. But essentially, adoption is pretty self-explanatory. This is where you find an OER that's already in existence, and it's pretty much fits your course already. There's not going to be a lot of need for adapting, not a lot of need for changing your course. So, if you find something like that, that's great, and you can get compensated for it. And then kind of moving upward through the different types of grants, the remixing grants. This is where you would find some existing OER, but you're sort of adapting it, updating it, contextualizing it, improving it, combining it with other things to kind of make it your own and to make it more responsive to your students' needs. For this grant, only this grant actually, we consider applicants who are also using some library licensed materials. So these would be things like articles and ebooks and things that you would find within library databases. You should keep in mind though, that anything, from the library's collections that are used in your OER won't be accessible to anyone outside the university. And so, we ask that people try to be sort of sparing with their use of library licensed materials, or, when they're releasing their OER to be used by other people, that they're just letting people know that, yeah, these are paywalled resources, so you won't have access to those. The next grant is a support materials grant. This is for people who are already using OER, but are finding that they need to develop some ancillary materials to make that OER use successful. And so, for example, we have a grantee right now he's been using an open textbook for several years. He's been saving students quite a bit of money, but realizing that the book is in some ways sort of inadequate in that a lot of the teaching materials that would normally accompany a textbook are just missing. And so he applied and received a grant to develop some test bank questions to accompany that book. And so that's been a pretty successful project, and that's the kind of thing that we're kind of looking for with that grant. And then the course redesign, this is kind of a little different than the others in that it's less focused on the OER itself and more focused on accommodating your course sort of adapting your course to accommodate the new OER. And so you might apply for a course redesign grant if you're already sort of planning on redesigning a course, And this is a really good one to apply for because we also have sometimes some support from OTLT, for this grant. They have, I don't know if either of you know Shelby Herring or Pinar Selick, but they're a couple great instructional designers that have helped with these projects in the past. And sometimes OTLT will even kick in some additional funding for those projects as well, which is kind of nice. And then finally, the OER creation grant. This is the big one. And this is the grant where we compensate people for writing sort of an open textbook or a textbook equivalent. So this is meant to be sort of the main text that would be used in your course, right? And we compensate these up to $10,000. Sometimes, we do try to kind of keep that award as close to $10,000 as we can, because we know it's an onerous process and something that takes a lot of work. But like last year, for instance, almost all of our applications were for OER creation grants. And so we didn't have enough money to fund all of those great projects. And so we ended up funding some of them at like the $8,000 to $9,000 level. So that could be a possibility again this year. We may have to sort of revise some of the awards downward, but we really don't want to, go too far down with some of these things. So it's kind of a balance between making sure people have the resources they need to complete these and making sure that we can sort of fund enough projects that we think are going to really be successful. So you'll want to give some thought to which grant you apply for before you actually apply. The call for proposals is a good place to kind of start in terms of figuring out whether or not you'd be a good fit for this grant. At the beginning, it kind of asks you, why should you apply? So this is not the only reasons you should apply, but some big ones are that, you're not happy with your textbook for whatever reason. Like maybe it doesn't cover the content well. Maybe it's too expensive. Maybe your students aren't buying it. Maybe you heard from your students that they don't like it. You should maybe consider applying for this grant if you answered yes to any of those questions. Also, people who are just sort of into pedagogical innovation. If you're somebody who's sort of an early adopter and an innovator and somebody who really, takes that kind of role seriously in teaching, we also would like you to apply too. Who's eligible to apply. So I mentioned university faculty and graduate students, but it's really open to anyone with teaching responsibilities. We do actually have one grantee who's not faculty or grad, and she's just a staff member who teaches in an academic department. And so, that's possible too. We also want these proposals to be for creating resources for credit-bearing courses at University of Iowa. So at the end of this, we really want these resources to actually be used at UI, right? We want them to be used outside of the university as well, but primarily we want them to be used here. And then also we're looking really for detailed, realistic plans for completion. So the application will kind of walk you through that. I'll open up the application too in just a second, but we're really looking for you to have kind of thought out like a well-designed plan for this, like how you're going to get it done, what you want to do, you know, and why. So yeah, this is pretty much duplicative with what we saw on the webpage. But then there's also sort of some expectations for the grant recipients. Again, we would like them done roughly within a year. It says recipients must complete relevant training sessions or training materials. There's just one orientation session, essentially. Recipients must submit short benchmark reports. Yeah, we do sort of have periodic meetings. We try to meet once a semester to kind of discuss benchmarks and talk about progress and things like that. And then, yeah, there's some additional resources and stuff here too. But so yeah, that's kind of the basics of the call. And then I'll open up the application itself. For whatever reason, Qualtrics keeps taking me to the middle of the application. I think that's because I've opened it in the past. But we'll just go back to the beginning here and I'll kind of walk you through the application itself. So the first part is just very basic information about you, about your project's title, your department, and whether or not you have experience using OER. Now, you don't have to worry about this. We're not going to say, oh, this person doesn't have experience, so you know we're not going to fund them. It's just that if you do have experience with OER, sometimes you know things can go a little easier for you. Maybe you already have some work that you'd like to build off of. Maybe your timeline will be a little different if you have some experience using OER. Co-applicants too, a lot of times these are done in teams. And I really would encourage you to apply as part of a team if you can, just because, you know, many hands make lighter work, right? And then the next screen kind of asks you to talk a little bit about the course that you'd be targeting for the intervention. So, yeah, you know, ask for the course number and how many sections we'll be using the OER. We look at the total enrollment per semester, so we can kind of calculate how many students this will be impacting. And then frequency and things like that. And then down here, it asks if you have the authority to select materials. So I guess that is sort of another thing that you have to have in order to apply for this, is the ability to actually control the materials used in your course. That's not always the case, especially for like TAs and grad students. Will you be replacing a commercial textbook? So just say yes or no to this. If you say no, it's not like you're disqualified or anything. You know, we do look at other things besides cost savings. So, you know, just let us know if you are using a commercial textbook, make sure you include all of the bibliographic information about that book so that we can look it up and, you know, verify how much it retails for and things like that too. And that will help us when we're trying to calculate cost savings for these projects. And then you have to sort of select which award you want to apply for. And then you get into the fun part, the essay questions. So these are very short essays. They're only 300 words or fewer, but all of these essay questions align pretty exactly to the rubrics that we use. And so I'll go out right now to the rubrics so we can kind of look at how these things are evaluated. And we all sort of evaluate the applications individually as reviewers, and then we come together afterwards to discuss our results. And so you'll notice that these lines on the rubric do pretty much correspond to those essay questions. So we're looking for, first of all, objectives. So we're looking at the objectives and we're trying to see if they're well-defined and articulated. We're trying to see that, you know, you've reflected on not only the objectives, but how you're going to meet them. And the objectives can simply be to save students money. I mean, that is a relevant and fine objective, but there are others too that people will sometimes highlight. You know, they'll talk about gaps that currently are not being met in their class and kind of how they're going to address those gaps. Impact, you know, this is talking about, you know, what will actually be different once you start implementing this OER. What do you hope that students will be doing differently than they're doing now? The plan for the timeline. So we're looking again for you to sort of tell us how you're planning on structuring that year that you have to get this done. We're looking more for feasibility rather than ambition. I'll just say that. We get a lot of applications for people that are planning to write a textbook over the summer. And that's not feasible in most cases, unless you have a lot of the work already done or you're working with a large team or something like that. So we look for, you know, feasibility. I mean, if your timeline is actually like longer than a year, maybe it's a year and a half instead of a year, we would rather see that if that's really what you think it's going to take, rather than, you know, sort of thinking optimistically about what you could do if you had a sort of an ideal time frame. Plan for assessment. So we do ask that grantees assess their work after they're done and make sure that it's actually as meeting the outcomes and objectives that you sort of set out to address. And we leave this up to each project team for how they want to do this. So we don't require any sort of particular assessment, but some things that people have done before, like pre-post tests. So some people look at like student performance before they start using the OER, and then after. There's some problems with that. There's a lot of variables at play there, and it's very hard to sort of attribute any sort of difference just to the book. But some other things people have done are student surveys, where they've asked students as part of their end of course evaluation to talk about the book. Others have used focus groups. They've sort of met with faculty who are using the textbook and talked as faculty about the book and what could be different or what could be better. And then, so we do look for that. And then cost savings. So we look at enrollment, we look at the current cost of the textbook, and we look, at how much money students would be saved with those two factors. And if there's pretty much any cost savings at all, we end up giving that category 5 points. If there's a potential for cost savings, meaning like somebody's developing a book, but they're not quite ready to get rid of their commercial textbook yet, but maybe they will in the future, or maybe they're developing some kind of ancillary material that might become a full textbook in the future, then we would give 3 points for that sort of project. If there's no cost savings or really no potential for cost savings, they don't get points for that. But you'll notice I've been talking a lot about cost savings, but it's actually just one line on the rubric, right? It's not worth more points than any of the others. New this year, we also have a line for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're looking for proposals that really sort of have a commitment or demonstrate a commitment to meet the needs of all students. And so this can mean different things, right? So maybe your course that you're planning on targeting sort of, your textbook maybe disproportionately affects a certain group. Maybe there's, first generation college students, maybe there's like a lot of first generation college students in your class and they're really struggling to afford the book. You'd want to sort of speak to that in this question. You'd also want to speak to how you address diverse perspectives in your writing. So one thing that we really would like to see more of is diversity in case studies and examples and images. So we don't just want to see the same types of people represented all the time. Also, we're really interested in making these accessible to students. So for students with print disabilities, but also students with other sorts of, limitations on how they might interact with the textbook. And there are a lot of them, people with learning disabilities, people who maybe don't have broadband, there's all sorts of different sort of ways that people can be hindered from learning through their textbook. And so we really want to see you address that in this question. And then finally, feasibility. We're looking really for compelling rationale for why you've chosen what you've chosen, and whether or not you can get it done, whether or not we think the budget's sufficient, the timeline's sufficient, the supports are sufficient. And so those are all the kind of factors that we're thinking about when we're evaluating these. And then, but they're not everything. Like we do come together and kind of talk about these projects as a group. And there may be, there oftentimes are like projects that maybe don't score as high on these rubrics, but there's just something about them that makes them very unique or very like pedagogically innovative. And so sometimes those will end up, getting funded, even if they don't, meet all of these rubric points. Okay, so I realize I'm kind of blazing through this pretty quickly, but I do want to go back to the PowerPoint really quick. Okay, how to apply. We've pretty much gone through all this, but you should start by reading the call for proposals. Kind of think about what you would like to propose, right? So what course you'd like to target, what textbooks you'd like to replace, and how you're going to do that. The next is just really get familiar with OER in your discipline, as we kind of discussed already. And then you'll also, beyond just searching for OER in your discipline, you should probably also talk to other people sort of in your discipline who have used OER. And there's some departments on campus where there's very kind of robust activity around OER. One of them is in the languages. I know there's different language departments, but we've had quite a few successful language applicants, as well as social work. That's another big one. But, even if there's not like a very robust OER community at the university within your discipline, there may be sort of like outside of the university. So I encourage people to really just kind of join listservs, try to enter into OER conversations wherever they can. I can drop in the chat like some of the listservs that I follow. A lot of them are disciplinary specific, but what about the College of Nursing? Oh, that's a good question. I don't believe we've funded anything from the College of Nursing. We maybe have had an application or two, but we did have one from Public Health during our first round. That was really pretty interesting. It was like, there was a module that walked students through how to give a patient exam. And that was all done online through this interactive module system, which was pretty cool. And so we haven't received a lot from College of Nursing, but that does kind of bring up an interesting point, is like when we talk about diversity, we're also talking about diversity within different disciplines on campus too. So we try really hard to try to get folks funded from, you know, all of the different colleges, not just, you know, liberal arts and sciences. So that's a good thing to bring up. But yeah, the listservs are a great way to sort of enter the conversation. Some of them I'll just like talk about them real quick, but then I'll also drop them in the chat later. One of them that's really good to join is called LibOER. That one is from an organization called Spark. There's another one called the Open Education Network, which is good to join. And then there's one called the Iowa OER Google Group, which is a sort of Iowa specific OER community that, you know, discusses issues that are kind of unique to our state. And we also share out like new OERs as they're published, and we have a lot of professional development stuff through that organization as well. So once you've kind of entered into the community, I guess, the next thing you'll want to do is really outline and plot out your proposed project. And then as you're doing that, if you have questions about whether or not your plans sort of align with, you know, with OpenHawks, you can feel free to send me an email or set up a time to chat. You know, those oftentimes become very competitive applications if you sort of talk through your questions and things before the application. Okay, so what actually makes a strong application? Well, we talked about the rubrics, and we do, you know, try to hew pretty closely to those. But some other things that also make a strong application are that, well, if it impacts a lot of students and replaces an expensive textbook, yes. But we're also looking to address the needs of students underserved by the current course materials. Anything that involves students also makes a strong application. We've had several projects that are actually student authored, where the professor is sort of supervising the project, but the students are actually doing the writing. And wow, those projects often turn out just so great because, you know, students are really actively constructing their own learning in that situation. And so anything that involves students will definitely get like close consideration. Pedagogical innovation, we talked about that already, or meeting a strong curricular need, well thought out and realistic. And then, you know, if there are weaknesses or sticking points or, you know, things that you think maybe don't make your application so strong, just address those, you know, don't ignore them. Just you say, you know, kind of talk about why the situation is as it is. And sometimes, you know, the things that you might see as a weakness, our review team might not see as a weakness. So that is kind of the basics of OpenHawks. I'd like to leave the rest of the time now to hear any questions that you might have, or any you know, ideas that you're thinking about.
So I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
One is, what is the process if you want to get what you write published in an open access journal?
Oh, in an open access journal. Well, so open access journals are kind of a little bit different than OER in that they're sort of like more research oriented than teaching oriented. But like if you...
That's not necessarily the case. I have published teaching material. For example, the National Library for the Use of Case Studies in Science is peer reviewed, and it publishes teaching materials.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, if you were interested in submitting to an open access journal, I mean, you could do that sort of, I mean, you could apply for funding and get, you know, a grant to support that, but then you could also, yeah, like publish it in the journal too. I mean, we wouldn't try to say like, you know, we have first publication or anything like that. You know what I'm saying? Like we wouldn't, they would be,
so,
is what I'm trying to say.
So, because what I am interested in doing is I teach a really large class, well, really large, I don't know these days what's really large, but it has 400 students in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to develop case studies that are, I already am using, University of British Columbia and Michigan State actually have kind of like case study open repositories that I'm using for my class. And I would like to develop my own case studies with a graduate student or two, and then have them out for publication so the graduate students can have a peer-reviewed teaching publication. And the case study fits exactly with my teaching goals.
Okay.
So where would what kind of, would it be a support material grant that I apply for?
Well, I guess it would kind of depend on the role that it would serve in class. Like if those case studies are really sort of like core and would replace a textbook, then I would say you could apply for an OER creation grant. But if they're meant to sort of support the main text of the course, then it would be more of a support material. It's kind of just, you'd want to think about like, for OER creation, you want to think of the work as sort of like a textbook equivalent. So like if it would take about the same amount of work to develop these case studies as it would to write a text, then you would probably want to apply for the OER creation grant. But if it's meant to be more of sort of a supplement to the course, I mean, a part of it, but not the core part of it, then you might apply for the supplementary materials grant, or the support materials grant.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. We often struggle with this too. Like sometimes we'll see people apply for creation grant when it should be something else. And we kind of just have those conversations with people if we think it belongs somewhere else. But really, we're kind of looking at the amount of work that it will involve. That's kind of what the compensation amounts are tied to. So I would say if you're planning on really developing a ton of material, then you could apply for the creation grant.
So what I put in the chat is the link to the Michigan State repository, and you can see how it has how it's set up essentially. And for example, the one that's showing up in the front, should African protected areas combat ivory poaching crisis? I've used that very one in my class, and you see how it's done. They have a table of content. And then, you know, they have visuals, they have links to articles, they have tables. And then at the end of some of these, they will have questions. And so then the students work as a group to answer the questions. So I don't know in your experience if that's more of a supplementary material kind of thing or.
Well, I don't know. I'm kind of looking at that article right now, and it does look, I mean, there's a lot of content here. I would say this would be sort of on the cusp between like a support material, maybe would you plan on sort of incorporating what you develop into this particular system, or is this Gala system just for Michigan State?
Yeah, I think it's just for Michigan State, but I have, I wouldn't, and it's not peer reviewed. So it's something, I think that it would be really neat if we did something like that actually ourselves. Because I think what they do is they use their own graduate students to these, and then they leave them out there for everybody to use, whether it's at Michigan State or elsewhere. And so it's really OER in spirit in the sense that they are really promoting access.
Yeah. And
as I said, UBC is doing the same thing with the, and if I can find the link, I'll send it too. So, you know, it would be more like maybe a thematic repository if we did it at the largest scale here on campus, especially now that there's talk of having the new sustainability requirement in the gen ed. You know, I think that's what drove some of these people to do what they did.
Yeah, well, okay, so if you were going to be sort of like creating a similar sort of repository on campus, I would say that would be a pretty major endeavor. That would be definitely like more of a creation grant. You might want to think about, like, I'm looking at this site right now. It's great. It's like wonderfully dynamic. I don't know what platform they've used to develop this, but maybe they developed it themselves. But on our campus, we have some like out of the box tools that you can use to author OER, but for things that are more custom or things that you really want to display in a certain way, you could work with, potentially you could work with the digital, God, I can never remember their full name, the studio in the library.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, the digital production and something studio. But they make some really nice interactive sort of like digital humanities projects. And they're really kind of familiar with a lot of different web authoring platforms and things. So for something like that, I might encourage you. I mean, I'm thinking way ahead here, but you could potentially work with them to develop the interface and like the database and how you wanted everything to look.
I put the UBC overall thing there as well. And so
Okay.
what they may be a little bit shorter than some of them. Like this is one that we've used in class with the Sami indigenous people in Sweden, and kind of like, again, you see how it's done in terms of the text, photos, references, conclusions and suggestions and stuff like that. And you can see that it's like all Creative Commons license. So I just think this is the way a lot of institutions are going, and it would be nice if we were part of that process.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I would say, like, looking at both of these projects, if this is something that you're sort of aspiring to, I would say that would probably be an OER creation grant. Yeah. Any other questions?
Hi, sorry, I have a question.
Sure.
First, thank you so much for this great webinar. It was so good, but unfortunately, I missed the first 10 to 15 minutes. I think I wonder if I can have access to the recorded video.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I'm recording it. So afterwards, what I'll do, I'll send out the recording to the four of you, but I'll also put it on our OpenHawks website so that it'll just live there too.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
I had a question just about whether you get a grant or you don't get a grant. What kind of resources through OpenHawks or the library can we get as we are moving these types of projects forward?
That's a good question. So one of the things, so from the libraries, one of the things you could get support with is through the subject specialist. So every department kind of has a subject specialist. You may know yours.
Yeah, Jen DeBerg is ours.
Oh,
yeah.
Jen DeBerg, yeah, she's great. And she knows a lot about OER. She's been like on our committee and stuff like that in the past. So they can, so librarians can help with source material. They can help you find, things that you might incorporate into your own work. They can also show you some exemplars, they can help find some other things that others have done. The studio within the library, as I mentioned, can be useful for web design and for getting everything looking how it should be. And then what else? Oh, and then copyright help. Yeah. So my department is scholarly impact. We do a lot of work with copyright help. And so, like if you have a resource, you're like, man, I really want to use this, but I can't tell if it's openly licensed, or like maybe it's definitely not, but you really want to use it. Like we can help you navigate through all those issues as well. And then we try to help, I think my main role in this is kind of like, I try to find people the help they need, like for various things. So we've worked a lot with ITS, a ton with ITS actually, on just different like web authoring platforms. We use a lot of Pressbooks because we have a site license for that particular tool. And, it's one of the more popular ones kind of like out there. People are used to seeing that interface. And so for people who are doing like more text-based book-like projects, ITS can really help both with the back end of that and kind of like the user experience end of it too. And then their instructional designers up there too are really great with this stuff. Like unfortunately, I think it's a very small department. There's only like a few of them and they're pretty like busy, but in the past, they've always been able to kind of like find time to help with them, with things like creating media, with making things accessible, like if you have captioning that needs to be done, they can kind of help you find resources for that. What else? Yeah, they can help with best practices and sort of like course design too, which is great. One gap I would say that we sort of have at this institution is finding good support for multimedia creation. So we have this excellent studio for people who are in distance ed, but I think that studio is only available to people who are teaching in distance mode. I don't know, like with COVID, like is everyone in distance mode? I don't know how that works, but they have been a really great support for some of our applicants in the past, those who have access to that particular resource. But there's also the One Button Studios around campus. I've heard mixed things about those. I haven't really used them myself, but it's like ITS's sort of like quick and dirty media creation solution. We have one in the library, and I think there's a few others on campus too. And then, and then individual departments sometimes will have that too, like people in their IT who are good with multimedia and can kind of help design. So yeah, I mean, I think those are some of the types of supports we could provide, but there's also others too, like if you need graphic design help and editorial, that's a little harder, but we have been able to find help for that in the past too. We have a graphic designer in the library who's worked on like book covers, things like that. Yeah.
And these are all pieces that you're talking about that we would not include in the budget, correct?
Right. Yeah.
Because they're just available resources.
Yeah, for the most part, these would all be resources that would just be like freely available to anybody on campus.
Okay. And then that was my only other question. Are there any other good examples of what to include in the budget? So you gave some good examples, but yeah, that's where I'm still trying to figure out how I would, like you said, a salary potentially if you're using a group of people to help, that extra time, thinking of it that way.
Yeah, I would say any kind of, let's see, what are some other things? Like, we have one project where somebody is developing an OER for Swahili, and she needed to get some native speakers, some like video footage of native speakers. And so she used some of the money to buy a camera and to ship it and to get it like, you know, and that was not a small task, you know, but she used a lot of like some of her money for that. I'm trying to think of other sort of like material costs that people have incurred. Some have compensated interview subjects. So there are a couple of OERs where there's been sort of like interviews incorporated into it, and the interview subjects were given some money. So you can compensate people outside the university too, although it's a little trickier. Like you have to kind of go through your department for that, because I know they have like different ways of accounting for that. That can be a little tricky sometimes, but we've always managed to get it done, I think, in the instances where we've had to. And also with the budget too, like if it turns out that, you know, you thought you were going to have to allocate XYZ to this particular software or something, and it turns out, oh, actually we have access to that, you can just reallocate the money. You don't have to, you can just let us know, and it's pretty informal. You don't have to really like adhere to the budget, like to the letter, you know what I mean? Any other questions or anything? All right, I see, Yamila, you came in late, but we have recorded this, and so I'll send out the recording after the meeting so that you can see the rest of it.
Thank you very much. I was looking at the application form, and then I realized that this session was right now. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna.
Oh, nice. It's always good when that happens. But yeah, I'll send out the recording when we're done. But yeah, if nobody has any other questions, I'll just end the meeting, but feel free to let me know. I'll put my email in the chat. There's something else I was going to put in the chat too. Oh yeah, the listservs. I'll send that in a follow-up email, I think, rather than making everybody sit here. Okay, there's my email address. All right, well, I wish everybody good luck if they're thinking about applying. Feel free to just let me know if you have any questions. All right, see you later.
Thank you.